here. Thanks, George, for the introduction. So Jaclyn and I are here today to talk about our project, Getting a Grip on Green Space, Exploration of Built Environment Factors and Healthy Aging in the BC Generations Project. And so George, of course, introduced us already, but I'll just say I'm Millie, this is Jaclyn. I am a manager of research at WorkSafe BC. I'm pretty excited to be here today because the last time I think I attended one of these seminars in person was when I was a student about 10 years ago. When I saw everyone walking in with food, I was like, you're not allowed to do that. But I see now that the lab is over there and this is separate. So things have changed, but very happy to be here again. I run a research grants program at WorkSafe BC. I would just like to put a little plug in for our program because we do have awards available for master's, PhD, and postdoctorals through our research training awards and our Ralph McGinn awards. So you've probably heard about them because we have been here to talk about them earlier on in the term. They launched in October. And the deadline for the application is January 16th. So I encourage you to consider applying, and also please do feel free to reach out to me or any of my colleagues at WorkSafe BC who are involved in the research grants program. If you have any questions, if you want to talk about a project that you have in mind, or if you want to talk about suitability and fit, we're always available to answer questions. All right. Jaclyn, did you want to do a quick?
Yeah, no, hi, I'm Jaclyn. So as mentioned, I work at BC Cancer. I did not go to UBC, I went to SFU, but I did do one course here. So in a way, it's like coming home almost. And then I work in the capacity we're going to be presenting today as a methodologist, but the other hat that I wear at BC Cancer is a data access manager. So researchers, which could be you guys, or a PI at any institution, can apply for data and biosamples from our project and do their own research projects. Yeah, if you want to know more information, I'll plug one slide, but otherwise you can chat with me after the presentation.
You want to just take over now? Because you're doing
sure. Yeah. Okay, so we already did a land acknowledgement, but again, just want to respectfully acknowledge that we're gathered here today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam First Nation. And getting into the background of today's presentation, as I'm sure you're all very aware and have been told many times by other presenters, we have an aging population here in Canada. So that poses a challenge not only to the individuals who live here, who are getting older, but also to our healthcare system. We have limited resources. So there's a focus, especially right now. I believe there's like an Edwin Leong Center for Aging that started, probably because of this issue. There's a focus for researchers to figure out how to help people live healthier for longer or be healthier as they age, which will not only help our healthcare system, but will also improve the quality of life of the people who live here. So when you think about how to make people healthier, you're probably thinking some is in their control, some is not. Genetics are not in their control, as much as I wish I could say, okay, go change some of your genes, mix around some SNPs, and you'll be fine. We can't do that. The other part of it is their environment and their lifestyle. So a lot of people, when they think of how to make people healthier, will automatically think of the individual actions. They have to eat better, they have to exercise more. But what I like to think of is more the system level changes. What can we change in their environment to make that healthy choice for them, the easier choice, or even better, no choice at all? Some examples might be smoking restrictions or fragrances in the workplace. That's a system level change that will help people's health that they don't have to consciously think about doing necessarily because there's guidelines put around them. So the focus on system level changes is specifically on modifiable risk factors, and the one that we're going to be talking about today is the environment. So trying to put on your caps here as a researcher yourself, if you had to pick a single best or most practical physical measure of whether an older adult is healthy, which would you choose? And we have a few options on the screen. First is the ability to stand up unsupported. Do they have a normal BMI? What's their grip strength? And their lung function test. We'll wait a few seconds here to see. Okay. Yeah, so it looks like we have a majority as A. There is no correct answer. I'll just say that right away. You guys can probably guess that. There's a number of ways that you can measure health, and sometimes the most practical measure is not going to be the best way, but it is a way that researchers can start to approach this topic a bit more. Oh, do I have to share the results button? Or, yeah, no? Should this, ah, okay. Yeah, so we had 60% that chose A, and then a combination for the other ones. Okay. Oop. Quick button. So is health and aging simply the lack of frailty? There's a number of ways that people measure health as they age. It could be the amount of medications that they require or how well they maintain their health conditions. It could be their cognitive status. You see a lot about MoCA scores, things like that. It could be the degree of social connectedness they have. So if they're in a situation, do they have a support system that they can rely on to get them to the doctors, to get their needs met? There's genetics, of course, and then there's things that are more personal, like their physical activity levels, their strength, etc. Frailty, by definition, is a geriatric syndrome characterized by the decline of cognitive and physical reserve. And there's two common measures that we see in the research. It's grip strength and bone density. And there are standards for what's considered a good grip strength and what is a good bone density. You'll notice that for grip strength, it's sex specific. So the threshold is lower for females of what's considered a normal, clinically normal grip strength compared to males. So grip strength has emerged as a reliable biomarker of health. It's been shown in other studies to be a predictor of all-cause mortality of a number of conditions such as cancer, cardiovascular disease, dementia. And this has been observed across ages and across sexes. So increased physical activity can build strength, but adherence to people's physical activity levels as they age is a challenge. And so grip strength is something that we're interested in looking at within this population to see if we can see what's going on environmentally that might impact their grip strength. So I'll get into the methods now. As I mentioned, I work with the BC Generations Project. This is a project I will also say that any one of you could have done. We do have data available. I'll plug that more in the next slide. But BCGP is the largest longitudinal cohort study in the province. It captures data from about 30,000 people that we recruited starting in 2009 through 2015. That's a lot of people. It's a lot of data. At the time they were recruited, they were between the ages of 35 and 69. So currently, our average age of our recruits is 70. So when we think about our aging population and trying to get good insight as to what the situation is in these people's lives, we have an aging population in our subset of 70-year-olds approximately that we can gain valuable insight from as far as how and where they live. So a little bit more about BCGP as a research resource. As I mentioned, we have nearly 30,000 people that were recruited. These participants completed a number of different questionnaires. We have more than 68,000 questionnaires completed. We collected biosamples from these participants, so blood, urine, and for some smaller groups, stool, for those interested in microbiome research. And what that allows us to do is look at potentially serial samples over time for a smaller group that have given us multiple biosample collections over the period of their follow-up with our study. We also link annually to the cancer registry and to VitalStats BC, so we can see that over time, some of our participants are getting cancer. We can see what type of cancer they're getting, the grade of it, and people can look at this to figure out if there was predictors earlier on in their follow-up that might have played a role. A bit over half of our participants provided physical measures. So that included a bioimpedance. We had their BMI measured. We got their bone density, their grip strength, which as you can guess from the title of today's talk is what our focus is. And for a smaller group, we do have some lung spirometry results. If you're interested in more about the study, I put a couple links at the bottom, but I'm also happy to chat after the presentation. So for this study, it was a cross-sectional design at baseline of our participants. We used people that had provided a physical grip strength measurement and had complete data on age and sex. And then we added in a number of their built environment factors and their information based on questionnaire responses. Their grip strength was measured with this tool that you see on the right. This is called a digital hydraulic hand dynamometer. We took measurements twice on each hand, and for the purpose of this study, we took the average of whichever hand was stronger. We do have some people that for whatever reason couldn't use one arm, so to take the average of both wouldn't be a great metric of how capable they were of doing their daily tasks. Normal grip strength was measured based on clinically accepted sex-specific thresholds, as we mentioned before, and the outcome of interest for this study was whether they had clinically weak grip strength, so they were below that threshold. We then looked at their exposures based on linkage to Canoe, and that was linked by their 6-digit postal code at baseline. So Canoe, maybe a show of hands. Is anyone familiar with this group already? Yeah. Chris would be. Canoe is the Canadian Urban Environmental Health Consortium. They're a group that compiles data across Canada and have these models that they can then link to various studies by address. So if a researcher creates a model based on fine particulate matter, for example, and they make that available, Canoe can link those metrics to individuals in a study. Researchers can then use those metrics to look at the relationship between air pollution and other factors. So there's a number of exposures and metrics available from Canoe. If you go on their website, there's probably at least 100 of them. For the purpose of this study, we just focused on a select few. So sulfur dioxide, fine particulate matter, light at night, walkability, nitrogen dioxide, green space, and urban density. So when we were modeling this, again, our outcome was that weak grip strength. Our main exposures of interest were each of those exposures I just mentioned, and then we adjusted for a number of factors. So these were put into logistic regression models to look at the association between having a weak grip and the built environment. We measured each of the exposures both continuously as well as categorically. We repeated analysis, adding covariates to the models, which not only included the factors that you see visualized on the right, but also the other built environment factors. A lot of research currently out there that focuses on green space, for example, will just have green space, but they don't adjust for light at night or road density or other things that we know are related and could be part of the relationship with the outcome they found. So the benefit is that with our study, we have those measures also. We can include them in the model. For any missingness, which ranged between 0.3% to, I believe, 7% was the most missingness we had in some of those covariates, we used multiple imputation by chained equations to handle that missing data. And we also looked at, for the significant relationships, whether there were cross-product terms between the environment factor and age, sex, or income that could be working as an effect modifier. Okay. I'm going to pass things over to Millie now for the results, starting with a poll question.
Thanks, Jaclyn. So we'll kick things off with the results here with a poll question. So the question is, what proportion of our sample would you expect to have clinically weak grip strength? So this question does have a right answer. And if you recall, Jaclyn was saying that there are sex-specific cutoffs for grip strength where less than 32 kilograms for men and less than 20 kilograms for females is considered clinically weak. Just let that run for a couple minutes. Okay. Okay, so all right, so we've got some results here. So most folks went with 20%, followed by 35%. Oh. Okay, so in our final cohort, which was a group that had complete data for grip strength, sex, and age, we were left with 15,068 individuals. And within that group, 95% of participants had clinically normal grip strength for their sex. So the answer to the previous poll question was 5%. Amongst men, the average grip strength was 46 kilograms, and for women, it was 28. We had a primarily female cohort at 69%. The average age was 56 at baseline. Majority of our participants never smoked more than 100 cigarettes. About 42 had at least a bachelor's degree. 86% approximately non-Hispanic white ethnicity. And as I think Jaclyn previously stated, most of our cohort lived within an urban area at about 73%. So we did do some correlation analyses between the various built environment factors. And you can see for the most part, there were no really strong correlations. There were some moderate correlations here, as you can see by the R values in this graph. Something of interest is that previous BCGP work has found that light at night is typically sourced by security lighting in industrial areas, street lamps, and highways. And so it wasn't all that surprising that our light at night variable was moderately correlated with pollutants like PM2.5 and NO2. And then conversely, greenness, which can sort of act as a buffer for light, as well as air pollution, was inversely correlated with NO2 and light at night. So I'll get into, this is kind of the meat of the results here. So this graph depicts the continuous analyses that were conducted to determine odds ratios of the relationships between each built environment factor and hand grip strength. So you can see that we have both adjusted and unadjusted odds ratios presented here. The adjusted are the circles and the unadjusted are the triangles. For the most part, our findings followed as we sort of expected them to. So firstly, we found that after adjusting for the covariates that Jaclyn touched on, our odds ratios tended to attenuate and shift towards the null. So that wasn't too surprising. Also, we found that with about one exception, I believe, our built-in, our air pollutants, so the SO2, PM2.5, for instance, they were positively associated with the odds of having clinically weak grip strength. So more exposure to air pollutants resulted in a higher odds of having weak grip strength. On the other hand, with greenspace, we found that increasing exposure to greenspace was resulted in a lower likelihood of having clinically weak grip strength. So again, kind of as you would expect. One of the exceptions here was walkability. So we found that walkability was was positively associated with odds of having a clinically weak grip strength, not entirely intuitive, but looking at a previous study that was conducted in Alberta that used the same walkability index that we did, they actually found similar results to us where there was this positive association. And the authors of that study were sort of hypothesizing that walkability indices in general, which look at things like points of interest, intersection, and dwelling density, might not really capture those aspects of the built environment that support muscular fitness. So, you know, like access to resistance equipment, for example, or like steepness. So a potential reason for that observation. Now, I just want to note that we did conduct categorical analyses, as Jaclyn touched on. Categorization was done by establishing quartiles of exposure for all the built environment factors. That's not presented here in this slide, but in general, what we found in the continuous analyses sort of held true in the categorical ones. And I will go into a couple in the next slides here, where we talk about the results for the two built environment factors that were significantly associated with grip strength, those being sulfur dioxide and greenspace. So this table here shows the categorical analysis for greenness. The first column there are the odds ratios after adjusting just for age. And the second column is after adjustment for all of the lifestyle, demographic, and built environment factors that Jaclyn touched on. So you can see exposure is split up into quartiles there. We measured greenness as the average annual NDVI per postal code for each participant. And so I think greenness probably provided the most compelling results. You can see here that there was generally a dose-response relationship. So, as exposure to greenness increases, the odds of having a clinically weak grip strength declined. And then the highest quartile of exposure was significantly associated with grip strength. And so here we're moving on to the SO2 categorical analyses. And these results were a little less intuitive than greenness. And we think that there's likely some caution warranted in interpreting these results. So for one, you can see that there is no sort of dose response trend, but also a couple other factors of note are, after adjustment for covariates, you can see that the odds of having a clinically weak grip strength actually increase, which is kind of not what we would have expected. And also only the second highest quartile of exposure was significant. So one potential reason behind this is our SO2 levels amongst our cohort were really quite low. So the average exposure was 0.4 parts per billion. 50% of our of the SO2 levels were between 0.23 and 0.6 ppb. And compared to the Canadian standard for exposure averaged over a year, it was, again, our average exposure was really low. In comparison, the Canadian standard is 4 ppb, so quite a bit lower. And I'll also note that in the BCGP cohort, exposure to SO2 is primarily around industry like pulp and paper, metal smelters, and oil and gas. And so those sites tend to be in more rural areas. And as we already touched on, most of our cohort was concentrated in urban areas. So again, generally, exposure was likely low for SO2. All right, I'll move on to the discussion here. So just a summary of our key findings. As we already stated, SO2 and greenness were the only two built environment factors that were significantly associated with hand grip strength. And that was independent of all of the covariates that we adjusted for. So our greenness finding is consistent with a previous study that was conducted amongst over 100,000 adults in China. And in that study, they used a slightly different metric for assessing greenness. They looked at average exposure within a 500-meter buffer. And they found that exposure was associated with a 5% decreased odds of clinically weak grip strength. And so, they used a somewhat different metric for exposure, but directionally their results were consistent with ours. So we didn't find any compelling associations for any of the other built environment factors. And as I kind of already touched on with SO2, one potential reason for this could be the relatively low concentrations of pollutants we saw in our study. So compared to a French study, the Constance's study that did find that PM2.5 and NO2 specifically resulted or were significantly associated with a higher odds of having clinically weak grip strength. Our PM2.5 and NO2 levels were somewhere between 50 to 70% lower than what they observed. So again, potential explanation for our findings. Jaclyn touched on analyses that were done to see if sex, age, or income were effect modifiers. And those analyses showed us that we didn't find any significant evidence that any of those three factors were modified the relationship between greenness or SO2 and hand grip strength. All right, so I think we've got our last poll question here. And the question is, what mechanisms do you think are at play in the greenness grip strength relationship that we observed? And so we've got a few options here: reduce stress and inflammation, fresh air and better muscle oxygenation, better blood sugar management with physical activity, reduce noise and improve sleep, or all of the above. And it's looking like folks are on the right track here. I'll leave this up for a few more seconds. Okay. Okay, so majority of folks selected all of the above. And we're generally aligned with that answer. There's a lot of potential mediators or mechanisms explaining the relationship. Based on our literature review, there's more work that needs to be done on identifying whether there is a central pathway or like a primary sort of explanation. But physical activity, potential factor. So this is something that we looked at. And in our study, at least, we didn't find, so after adjusting for physical activity, we found that it did not attenuate the relationship between greenness and hand grip strength. So didn't seem to explain the relationship in our study, at least. Our findings were consistent with a couple other studies, a Canadian one and a UK-based one, that looked at physical activity as a mediator, and their mediation analyses did not suggest physical activity was a significant mediator. That being said, physical activity has been connected to improved grip strength. It has been shown to be a mediator between greenness and overall sort of general health. So potentially worth exploring. And it could be other benefits of physical activity that are at play here as well, like better insulin resistance, for example, or reduced stress. Air pollution potential explanation here. As I already said, the air pollutants in our study did not, after adjusting for them, did not attenuate the relationship between greenness and hand grip strength. That being said, though, air pollution does contribute to inflammation, oxidative stress, and insulin resistance. All of these three factors have been associated with loss of muscle strength and mass. And then air pollution itself has been connected to sarcopenia as well. And then finally, relaxation. So there's been plenty of work showing that exposure to greenness increases one's state of relaxation. And that in turn can reduce inflammation in the body, as well as improve sleep. And so those are also factors that have been connected to improved muscle strength. So overall, lots of potential sort of physiological mechanisms at play, and it might be worth it to conduct sort of serial biosample collection and connecting that to over time, seeing how that plays out over time, to see if any of these individual factors can explain that relationship. And I'll just conclude here with some strengths and limitations of our study. So, we looked at multiple built environment factors. Through our literature review, we noted that many studies just focus on one factor, but we were able to consider multiple built environment factors and adjust for all these various aspects of the built environment. We had a relatively large sample size at about 15,000 people. And we also were able to measure grip strength objectively. Some weaknesses, of course, this was a cross-sectional design, and we would benefit from more longitudinal studies in this area to understand causality. All of our built environment factors were assessed at the postal code level, so that doesn't necessarily reflect individual exposure. And then I think Jaclyn touched on this, but physical activity was assessed. Some folks completed a long version of the physical activity assessment form, and then others filled out a short version. So there could be a little bit of discrepancy there in sort of normalizing those physical activity levels by individual. All right, and that concludes our presentation here. So we will welcome any questions.